All right, so today we are taking a deep dive into intentionality, which I know is a concept that's probably already on your radar as a philosopher, but we're gonna go a little deeper than just the surface level here. I've got your stack of sources right here, and
hmm
with expert speakers' help, we're gonna see if we can't pull out some of uh, those aha moments. The things that even a philosopher like yourself might find interesting.
Well, intentionality is one of those terms that sounds very simple on the surface, but then it can lead to some surprisingly complex ideas in philosophy. So,
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's funny when I first started thinking about intentionality, I thought it was just about like intending to do things,
yeah.
like having goals or making plans. But
Yeah.
but I quickly realized it's so much bigger than that. It's like this whole universe of aboutness, wouldn't you say?
That's exactly right. Yeah. It's not just about what we're consciously trying to do, it's about how our thoughts, our beliefs, our desires, even our perceptions, they're all
Mhm.
directed towards something. They're all about something, whether that something exists in the real world or not.
So I guess to make sure I'm understanding this right, it's kind of like saying our minds are always pointing at something, even if that something is totally made up.
I think that's a great analogy. Think about a cat chasing a laser pointer, right? That cat's whole world, its whole intentionality is focused on that little red dot. Now, the dot itself doesn't actually exist, right? It's just light, it's just a projection. But for the cat in that moment, it's the only thing that matters.
Okay, I get it. Yeah. So it's like the cat's eye view of reality that matters, not necessarily whether that reality matches up with, some objective truth.
Exactly, and this is where Franz Brentano comes in, the philosopher who really put intentionality on the map. He had this very famous definition of mental phenomena, which states that they are characterized by what he calls the intentional inexistence of an object.
Wow. Okay. The intentional inexistence of an object. I'm gonna have to write that one down. So, are we saying that our minds can be about things that aren't actually, out there in the world?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. He was saying that even thoughts about things like unicorns, square circles, winning the lottery, all things that don't have a real counterpart, out there in the real world,
Yeah.
they still have this aboutness, this directedness, this intentionality.
Intentional inexistence. I love it. It's like a built-in paradox. It's like,
hmm
okay, but how does this idea actually work in real philosophical arguments? Are
Yeah.
there any examples from the sources that really show how intentional inexistence plays a key role?
Absolutely. One of the sources here has an argument about the nature of morality and whether moral values actually exist objectively or if they're just, things that humans have made up. And this philosopher uses the idea of intentional inexisters to say, even if moral values don't exist, like, out there in the universe somewhere, our beliefs and judgments about them still have a kind of reality.
Oh, okay. So even if goodness isn't like floating around in space somewhere, the fact that humans can think about it, can argue about it, can even build whole ethical systems around it, that gives it a kind of existence.
Exactly. It exists in the realm of human intentionality, which, as Brentano said, is one of the defining features of mental phenomena.
Okay, that is super helpful. So we've talked about thoughts about things that don't exist. What about when we think about something that we know is out there in the world? Something real, like my very full and very real coffee mug right here.
That brings us to what we call singular thoughts,
Yeah.
which are thoughts directed at specific existing things. So your thought about your coffee mug, that's my coffee mug, is a singular thought because it's about that specific object that really exists.
Okay, so a singular thought has to be about a specific thing, not a general category, right?
Yes, exactly. So that's my coffee mug is singular, but all coffee mugs are good, would be a general thought.
All right, so far so good.
hmm
So we've got thoughts about things that don't exist, and we've got thoughts about specific things that do exist. Is that pretty much it, or is there more to this intentionality puzzle?
Well, there's always more to explore in philosophy. Even with singular thoughts, there's a really interesting puzzle about how our internal private thoughts can be about things out in the world.
Yeah, that is kind of freaky when you think about it. Like,
Yeah.
how does my brain form a connection with something outside of itself? It's almost like magic.
That's the challenge. And it's one that philosophers have been grappling with for a long time. How can thoughts, which seem to be in this inner subjective world, actually latch on to things in the external world?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if we're all just, living in our own little thought bubbles, totally disconnected from anything outside of ourselves.
That's a question that we might need a whole other deep dive to unpack. But luckily, philosophers have come up with some tools to try to understand this connection between thought and world. One of the most famous is Gottlob Frege and his distinction between sense and reference.
Ah, Frege. Always a good time to talk about sense and reference.
Hmm.
Now, remind me, how do those ideas help us with this mind-world connection problem?
Well, think about it like this. You have a photograph of your childhood home, and then you also have the address written down. Now, both the photo and the address refer to the same thing, your childhood home. That's the reference, the actual thing in the world. But they do it in different ways, right? The photo gives you a visual image, a way of picturing the house, whereas the address is just, a set of coordinates. Those are the different senses.
So it's like two different ways of pointing at the same piece of reality.
Exactly. Two different ways of accessing it. And now think about how this applies to our thoughts. Let's look at an example from one of your sources. There's a discussion about personal identity, and they're talking about, let's say, a person named Sarah. Now, one description of Sarah focuses on her physical traits, her height, her appearance, and so on. And the other description focuses on her psychological traits, her personality, her beliefs.
Okay, so two different ways of describing the same person, Sarah.
Got it. Now, both of those descriptions are about Sarah. They have the same reference, but they're presenting her in different ways, highlighting different aspects of who she is. Those are the different senses. And Frege's point is that these different senses can really affect how we think about and interact with the world.
So even though both descriptions are about Sarah, they could lead to totally different interpretations of her, different conclusions about
Yeah.
her identity, right?
That's right. And that has some big implications for how we understand philosophical arguments. What an author meant might be slightly different from the literal thing they're referring to. We have to pay attention to those different layers of sense to really understand their intentionality.
Whoa, okay. This is getting really meta, isn't it? It's like philosophy is a hall of mirrors and we're trying to find the true meaning behind all the reflections.
I love that analogy. And it gets even more interesting when you realize that not all philosophers agree with Frege's emphasis on sense. There's a whole other school of thought that says sometimes we just refer to things directly without all those layers of sense getting in the way. It's called direct reference.
Oh, a philosophical rebellion. I like it. Tell me more about this direct reference.
Basically, it's the idea that sometimes we just point right at things with our words without needing all those descriptions or interpretations. Like, if I say Plato, I'm not necessarily thinking about all of his philosophical theories, right? I'm just referring to that specific person.
Yeah, that makes sense. It would be pretty exhausting if every time we said someone's name, we had to like mentally list all their characteristics.
Exactly. And this idea of direct reference has been really influential, especially thanks to a philosopher named Saul Kripke. He did a lot of work in modal logic, which is all about possibility and necessity.
Modal logic, possible worlds, and all that. All right, I'm ready for this direct reference rebellion. Let's hear it.
Okay, well, in one of your sources, there's a really interesting argument about the philosophy of language. They're arguing that some terms refer directly to things in the world, regardless of what we currently know about them. Like, for example, the term water.
Okay, so even if our scientific understanding of water changes, the word water still refers to that same stuff, right? Even if we discover new things about its chemical composition or whatever.
Exactly. And this direct reference theory makes us think about how much of our philosophical thinking is based on these direct connections to the world versus more complex interpretations that rely on layers of sense.
Wow, this is a lot to take in. We've gone from laser pointer cats to philosophical rebels, and my brain is definitely feeling the burn. But this deep dive into intentionality is already making me think about my own philosophical work in a whole new way.
I'm so glad to hear that, because even though it might seem like a very specific concept, intentionality really touches on so many fundamental questions in philosophy.
Yeah, more than I ever realized. And I can't wait to keep going with this in part two. All right, so we're back. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea that our minds can be about things that don't even exist, you know?
Mhm.
It's a fascinating concept, but also kind of a mind bender. I mean, if we can think about things that aren't real, does that mean they have some kind of reality just because we can think about them?
Well, you've hit on one of the most fundamental and hotly debated questions in all of philosophy, and that is, do intentional objects, those things that our thoughts are about, even if they don't exist, do they actually exist in some way?
Yeah, that's what I'm struggling with here. It feels like a question that could send us spiraling down an endless philosophical rabbit hole.
It absolutely could, but luckily your sources actually offer some pretty compelling arguments from both sides of this debate. It's like, we're setting up a philosophical boxing match with heavyweights in each corner arguing for and against the existence of intentional objects.
All right, I like it. Let's get this philosophical fight night started. Who uh who do we have in the corner arguing for the existence of these intentional objects?
Well, one of your sources has a philosopher who argues that intentional objects do have a kind of reality, but not a physical one. And they use the example of fictional characters. We get emotionally invested in their stories. We feel joy when they triumph. We feel sorrow when they experience loss. If these characters were truly nothing, just, meaningless words on a page, how could they possibly evoke such powerful emotions in us?
I totally get that. I know I've definitely shed a tear or two over the fate of a fictional character. It really does feel like we're connecting with something real, even though, it's just in the world of the story.
Exactly. And this philosopher goes on to suggest that these intentional objects, they actually exist in a separate realm, which they call a realm of intentional being or meaning.
Hmm.
It's not a physical realm, obviously, but it's where our thoughts, our beliefs, even our fictional creations reside.
A realm of meaning. That's an interesting idea. It's like we're creating these mental universes, right? Populated with characters and concepts that have a kind of existence, even if we can't point to them in the physical world.
That's a great way to think about it. But now let's bring in the challenger, the philosopher from another one of your sources who is pretty adamant that intentional objects do not exist at all. Their argument is that, well, the very notion of a non-existent thing existing is a logical contradiction. It's a recipe for philosophical chaos. They suggest that when we talk about fictional characters, we're actually just engaging in a kind of pretend mode of discourse. It's like, we're playing a game, suspending our disbelief for the sake of the story.
Oh, so it's like when I used to play make-believe as a kid, building forts out of pillows and blankets. I knew it wasn't real, but it felt real at the time.
Exactly. And this philosopher argues that, creating a separate realm of intentional being is unnecessary.
Hmm.
And ultimately, it leads to more philosophical problems than it solves. They say that our thoughts and our language can be about things without those things needing to exist in any realm, whether it's physical or otherwise.
So on the one hand, we have a philosopher saying these intentional objects exist in a realm of meaning, and on the other hand, we have a philosopher saying they don't exist at all, that it's all just a game of pretend.
Hmm.
It sounds like we've reached a bit of a philosophical stalemate.
Well, it's a debate that's been going on for literally centuries, and it's unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. But what is important is that we recognize how complex this issue is, and that we engage with the arguments on both sides. And whether or not we ultimately decide that these intentional objects exist in any meaningful sense, the very fact that we can think about them, create stories about them, have strong emotional responses to them, tells us something pretty profound about the power of the human mind.
It really does. It's like our minds are these incredible machines that can create entire universes, whether those universes, correspond to anything real out there in the world or not. And that creative power in itself is definitely something worth exploring further.
I completely agree. It suggests that the mind is not just, passively receiving information from the world, it's actively creating meaning. And that actually leads us to another really important point that often gets mixed up with intentionality, and that is consciousness.
Okay, so how does consciousness fit into all of this? Are intentionality and consciousness basically the same thing? I've definitely heard people use the terms interchangeably.
Yeah, it's a common misconception, even among philosophers sometimes. But it's important to remember that they are distinct concepts. Intentionality is about the aboutness of our mental states, that directedness toward an object. But consciousness is about subjective experience. It's about what it feels like to have thoughts and perceptions.
So hold on. Are you saying that I can have a thought that's about something without actually being consciously aware of it?
Exactly. Think about all the automatic processes happening in your body right now. Your breathing, your heartbeat, even digesting your lunch. Those are all processes that are directed towards a certain goal. They have intentionality, but you're not necessarily consciously aware of them all the time, right?
That's true. I'm definitely not sitting here thinking, okay, stomach, time to digest that burrito. It just happens.
Exactly. And even when we are consciously aware of our thoughts, there's still a big mystery surrounding the nature of those subjective experiences.
Hmm.
Philosophers call this the qualia problem. It's the problem of explaining what it feels like to experience things, like the redness of red or the painfulness of pain.
Right. It's like no matter how precisely we describe the color red, we can never fully convey what it feels like to actually see it. There's always this subjective element that's hard to put into words.
Exactly. And while there's no, universally agreed upon solution to the qualia problem, some philosophers believe that understanding intentionality more deeply might actually be the key. Maybe by figuring out how our minds represent the world, how they're about things, we can gain some insights into how those representations actually give rise to subjective experience.
Oh, wow. So the way our minds connect with the world, that aboutness that we've been talking about, could actually be a stepping stone to understanding the very nature of consciousness.
It's a really fascinating possibility. And it shows how intentionality, which can seem like this very abstract concept, is actually connected to some of the most fundamental questions about what it means to be a conscious being.
I love it. This has been such a great deep dive so far. We've gone from laser pointer cats to the realms of meaning. And honestly, I feel like my understanding of intentionality has like tripled.
I'm so glad to hear that. Intentionality is one of those concepts that the more you think about it, the more it unfolds, revealing all these layers of complexity.
Absolutely. But before we get too lost in the labyrinth of thought, maybe we should give our listener a little break and recap some of the key takeaways from this part of the deep dive. Okay, so we're back for the final round of our deep dive into intentionality. And I have to say, my brain is feeling a little bit like it's been doing philosophical push-ups.
I can imagine it's a lot to take in. But it's been a great journey so far, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's been an incredible workout for the mind. But I'm really eager to see how we can actually apply these ideas, make them useful, not just theoretical puzzles.
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways from our deep dive is that intentionality isn't just about passively reflecting the world, it's about actively constructing meaning.
Yeah, we've talked about how our minds are like arrows pointing at things, but it's more than that, right? We're not just receiving information, we're interpreting it, framing it, deciding what it means to us.
Exactly, and that realization has some pretty big implications for how you approach philosophical arguments, both in terms of analyzing the arguments of others and constructing your own.
Okay, so let's break that down a little. First, in terms of analyzing arguments, how does understanding intentionality help me become a more, perceptive reader of philosophical text?
Well, it allows you to go beyond just the surface level of the words and really try to understand the intentions of the author. What are they trying to accomplish with this argument? What are their assumptions? What are their motivations? Maybe even their unstated biases.
So it's like becoming a philosophical detective, right? Looking for clues beyond just the literal meaning of the text.
Exactly. And this is where Frege's distinction between sense and reference can be really helpful. Remember, two authors might be talking about the same thing, using the same terms, but they might have very different senses in mind. And those different senses can lead them to very different conclusions.
Right. So if I'm reading a debate about, say, free will, it's not enough to just look at whether they agree on a definition of free will. I need to also think about how they're each conceiving of it, what aspects they're emphasizing.
Exactly. And by paying attention to those subtle differences in sense, you can start to see where the real disagreements lie and maybe even uncover some hidden assumptions that are driving the debate.
Wow, okay, you've given me a lot to think about already. But what about constructing my own philosophical arguments? How does intentionality help me be more persuasive, more effective as a writer?
Well, I think the key here is recognizing that persuasion isn't just about logic. It's also about understanding the intentionality of your audience. What are their existing beliefs? What do they value? How does your argument connect with those deeper layers of meaning?
So it's not just about, winning the logical game. It's about connecting with the other person's sense of what matters, what makes sense to them in a bigger picture kind of way.
Exactly. And this is where understanding direct reference can also be helpful. Sometimes appealing to those shared intuitions, those direct connections we have with certain concepts or values, can be more persuasive than building really complex logical structures.
So if I'm trying to argue for a specific ethical principle, it might be more effective to start with a real-life example that people can connect with emotionally, rather than launching into a dense theoretical argument right away.
I think that's a great strategy because those direct connections, those shared points of reference, can help create a sense of common ground and make your argument much more impactful.
This is all starting to make so much more sense now. Intentionality isn't just this abstract concept floating around in the ether, it's a tool we can use to navigate the world of ideas and communicate more effectively.
I'm so glad that's resonating with you. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Likewise. But before we wrap up, I want to touch on that mind-blowing connection between intentionality and consciousness one last time.
Ah, yes. The question of how our minds, which are seemingly about things, can give rise to subjective experience, how they generate that feeling of what it's like to be conscious. It's a huge mystery, and while we haven't solved it today, we've definitely explored some really interesting possibilities.
We talked about how understanding the way our minds represent the world, the way they create meaning, might give us clues about how those representations lead to conscious experience.
Precisely. And it shows how intentionality, even though it might seem abstract at first glance, is connected to some of the deepest questions about what it means to have a mind.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. I feel like my understanding of intentionality has just exploded. And I know this new perspective will have a huge impact on my own philosophical work going forward.
I hope so. It's a concept that keeps unfolding the more you work with it, revealing new insights and connections.
But I'm definitely excited to keep exploring it. So as we bring our deep dive to a close, is there any final thought you'd like to leave our listener with?
Here's a challenge for you. Now that you've spent some time really thinking about intentionality, I want you to go back to your own philosophical work and look at it through this new lens. What new layers of meaning do you see? What assumptions are you making that you weren't aware of before? And how might this new awareness change your understanding, your arguments, even your engagement with the world of ideas?
That's a great challenge. And on that note, I want to thank expert speaker for guiding us on this incredible journey through intentionality. And to you, dear listener, keep those philosophical wheels turning.